Greetings, everybody. I'm Ezra, cannabis consultant. I am going to attempt to talk about the 650 million year history of cannabinoids. You can join me at facebook.com /Ezra Helps after my talk today if you're watching live to join the discussion. And you can find me at ezrahelps.com. If you're a science geek and you know anything about cannabis, you know anything about plants, you would know right off that 650 million years ago, there were no plants. So how can you have cannabinoids? How can you have cannabis 650 million years ago? Well, I love this story because it really begins with all organisms before plants even existed. So as you know from biology, every organism on the planet shares DNA. We have DNA. We all originate from somehow from a like life form, a similar life form. And as you go back in the tree, you start to see connections to where things developed, how the eye developed, how the spine developed, etc. So 650 million years ago is where they've traced the human origin of all vertebrate origin to the spine, to having a vertebrae at all, as well as the hormone production and nervous system and immune system balance. And this is because sea squirts, which are a little sea floor animal that are still around today. They kind of look like little blobby sea cucumbers, sea squirts. They had in their tadpole form, in their pre-adult form, in order to swim, they created a little soft tissue rod in their back that helped them swim. And this is the origin of the first vertebrae, of the first spine. And so we can find where the cannabinoids are in history, in biology, by tracing back to this moment. And we also know that all animals are, and all organisms need some way to fight off stress and pathogens, etc. So the sea squirts are the first origin of the DNA that evolved into cannabinoids, what we know as cannabinoids. And this is important because there are no cannabis plants in existence for hundreds of millions of more years. And I say this, I want to emphasize this point because we, in our culture, in our modern culture, we're obsessed with this idea that cannabis is this dangerous thing that is potentially harmful, or if it's a drug, we need to study it. Well, all we need to study is the endocannabinoid system in order to understand what the cannabis plant does to us when it goes inside of our body. The endocannabinoid system has its origins 650 million years ago with these sea squirts. And so I'll get into that a little bit in the future, but in a few minutes here. But first, I want to just give it some context. So if you go back to 350 million years ago, you have ferns. These are when ferns, they're spore-producing plants, were around. So you also get a sense of, wait a second, there's no flowering plants. There's not even, 350 million years after the first evidence of endocannabinoids, we don't even have a flowering plant yet. It's not until hundreds of millions of years later where the endocannabinoid system, which is this feedback system in the cells of vertebrate organisms, has been evolving so long and becoming so complex and intertwined with our systems that you get a sense of how important it is. And it's not until about 30 million years ago that you have the cannabis plant finally coming into existence, becoming its unique species. And the story or the theory behind why it's possible that the plant itself started to produce these chemicals, which we now call cannabinoids, because they connect with our endocannabinoid system, The way that this plant started to develop these cannabinoids is that it was first on the steppes of the Asian plateau, and this is the Himalayas, and you have the continents which are colliding, and they're creating the Himalayas, and the mountains are getting taller and taller every year. We still have Mount Everest, which grows by whatever, an inch every year, and these cannabis plants, which were in their beginning stages of development, were starting to get closer and closer to the sun. And that was stressing them out. The intense or increase of UV light was creating stress in their environment. And so they essentially created a genetic mutation, or the ones that could survive this were the ones that could produce THC. They could produce this chemical, tetrahydrocannabinol, which protected them from THC. And so they evolved and they perfected this system, and it helped them for millions of years. And then eventually apes evolved into, primates evolved into humans, and humans were around and exited Africa and entered this Asian steppe and the foothills of the Himalayas. So around 500,000 years ago, you have some human ancestors and pre-human ancestors who were in this region where cannabis was growing wildly, growing naturally. And it's very easy to just walk through a wild field today and start gathering these sticky resins from the plant, and very quickly realize that when you ingest this plant, when you get it on you, it has an effect on your body. So hundreds of thousands of years ago, it's pretty safe to assume that early humans were starting to feel the effects of the cannabinoids that were created in this plant enter into their system and tune into, to connect with our endocannabinoid system, the system that evolved from sea squirts hundreds of millions of years ago. The system's magically connected. You can think of it as a spiritual or magical coincidence, but really it is just a coincidence. We all share some biological history, so it's just a fascinating biological fact. That the plants were producing this chemical that was the right sequence and structure of molecules that managed to fit into us, but also fit into all pets that we have today, all vertebrates that exist on the planet. So I want to get into now our human connection to cannabinoids, because this is where it gets a little confusing for the human culture over the years. If you go back 50,000 years, there is evidence that humans were using herbs, because we can find the residue of specific herbs that were in their plaque tartar in these old skeletons that we find. So even though we think of cannabis use going back, 10,000 years, because that's the actual evidence for it, we can extrapolate and assume that it can go back many, many thousands of years before that. We don't have the definitive evidence yet, but it's possible. But what's fascinating about the Asian steppe and the foothills of the Himalayas is that we have the development of Ayurveda about 5,000 years ago BC. Ayurveda is the traditional medicine of India. It is the oldest continually passed down medical practice and culture in existence, in human existence. And one of the primary herbs of the thousands of herbs that they use in their repertoire is cannabis. And I love to tell this story because it's not often connected in the cannabis field, and that is, we have essentially two varieties of plants that we know of today, cannabis plants, that have different effects when we ingest them. We have indica plants, which are low growing and sedative, tend to be dense and fatter leaves. And we have sativa plants, which are taller growing, airier, and tend to have more creative and activating effects. And in Ayurvedic medicine, we have body types that refer to this. They refer to a body type called kapha, which is more dense, more low to the ground, more prone toward sedation. And there's a body type called Vata, which is more prone toward activity and movement and creativity. And I always like to speculate that there was a connection there between understanding how our bodies work, how different bodies need different things, and how these plants actually share similar qualities when we join them together. So as the plant needs various cannabinoids for its health, we also need various cannabinoids, and how the indica and sativa balance that out depending on what our body structure is. In the West, we would call these concepts ectomorph and endomorph and mesomorph. Ectomorph is tall and skinny, like me, I'm an ectomorph. An endomorph is more like Santa Claus, right? Thick and more curvy, wider face. That's like indica and sativa right there. So that's a fascinating connection to Ayurveda, early human history, and cannabis. But let's fast forward. So we also need to, connect science. And it wasn't until the 1800s that a famous doctor, physician, and scientist named William O'Shaughnessy was stationed in India, and he started to discover all of the uses of cannabis that had been passed down for thousands of years in India. And most of the claims for cannabis are now corroborated by science. So there's a lot of evidence there of the cannabis helping with pain, helping with sleep, helping with sedation, helping with muscle spasms, things like that. These were things that were discovered in the 1800s. And so he brought this herb back. He did some controlled trials on the cannabis, Indian hemp, they called it at the time, and found that it went crazy in Europe and later in America in the late 1800s. People started using this like crazy. The Queen of England at the time is famous for having used Indian hemp for her menstrual cramps. But the fascinating thing about cannabinoids in the plant is we didn't know what was happening in the plant. We didn't understand what cannabinoids were. We didn't understand what our system was in our bodies. So sometimes in America, even though we had hemp growing wildly that may not have produced THC, and then we had Indian hemp coming over with seeds that had higher THC, the culture and the medical field became really confused. And if you read my book, which is coming out in summer, you'll see I talk about this confusion in America, that you had certain states saying we should make this plant illegal because the cannabinoid content of the plants was really high, and people were getting too high in some cases. And other times they would find plants where the cannabinoid content was so low because it was just traditional hemp and the medicines weren't working. So eventually people did not understand it. It's my argument for why we should have practitioners, people like myself who understand cannabis, who understand the plant and how it's used in the body and can educate people. And it wasn't until the 1960s that we synthesized THC. We actually discovered THC in the plant as this chemical, which was the active chemical. Excuse me. So in the 1990s, 20, 30 years after we synthesized THC and discovered what THC was, that was when we actually discovered that THC was mimicking a chemical that we now call anandamide. Ananda meaning bliss in Sanskrit, coming from Ayurveda, right? Circling back to the Indian roots of the plant. A very important connection to the Indian culture and Indian Ayurvedic medicine with cannabis. So then we discovered that there was this system in our body that already produces these chemicals which are mimicked by cannabis and the chemicals in cannabis. So that's why we have in 1996 the legalization of medical cannabis in California. In 2005, we have the recreational legalization of cannabis in Colorado. And now we're at this amazing crux. And part of what my book talks about, Cannabis Consulting, is that we need to make sure that we are fully understanding how the endocannabinoid system works in the body, how cannabinoids work in the plant, so that we can go back to that original, hundreds of millions of years ago need for stress relief and balance in the body. If we go towards cannabinoids that are just super high in THC and we're only taking it recreationally, we can get out of balance. It can flood our endocannabinoid system and create imbalance. So it's important to know the history of endocannabinoids and know how they work in the body, so that we can use them for health, because our body doesn't care about getting high. Our body does care about maintaining balance, and that's what the endocannabinoids do in the system. So thank you for joining me on my live cast. Please join the discussion, facebook.com/Ezra Helps, or go to my website, EzraHelps.com. If you're curious about a consultation for health and how to use cannabinoids properly, then you can sign up for a consultation there. Thanks for joining me.